Afua was clearly far, far cooler than me because she's not here. She's fashionably late. I was embarrassingly early. So I shall never ever be able to compete with Afua on being fashionable. But I hope that I can compete on having written a book perhaps as good as hers. And given that my endorsement is on the back of Afua's book, I'm slightly biased. I've slightly got myself in a catch-22 situation here. I'm saying this is a brilliant book, not knowing it will be up against my book in London's big read. The question I always want to ask authors when I encounter them is why did they write this book? And whenever you write a book, there comes a time, usually late at night, you think, why on earth am I writing this book? And it's important to, when you write a book, it's important to think about where it sits within the books that have been written before and the books that you hope will be written afterwards. This book it's a reply and it's a homage to a book written by Peter Fryer in 1984, a book called Staying Power, which I read when I was a teenager, and which was the first book I ever bought with my own money from working in a sports shop on my Saturday job. And it was a book that changed my life because it was a book that showed that there was a reason, there was a story that I was part of, that I wasn't just this black kid from a black family who happened to be in the north of England like some sort of accident, that I was part of a long, long story, a story that was much longer than I could have possibly imagined before I picked up Staying Power. So this book is a response to that. But it was also a response to experiences that I had growing up and to absences. Being black and British is often about what doesn't happen, what's not acknowledged, as much as what does happen. Now, this book in some ways is a response to things that very much did happen to me, experiences of racism and racial violence, but it's also about absences, things that were invisible, that were never explained to me. As I say in this book, I was brought up in the north of England, and if you grow up in the north, if you're lucky enough to grow up in the north of England, not only are you automatically salt of the earth, but you are taught about British history in the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution. You're told that that is the part of British history that belongs to you. That was the moment when the north of Britain, the north of England, was the most dynamic place in the world. And so I was taught about spinning jennies and water frames. And I was taken on visits to factories and mills. And I was told every minute detail about how these machines worked, how these factories transformed the world. Every tiny little detail in all of these visits to all of these heritage sites and these mills, apart from one detail, which is where the cotton in the 4,000 mills of Lancashire came from. Every tiny microscopic detail of the process of turning cotton into the cloth that was Britain's biggest export throughout the 19th century, apart from where the cotton comes from. The cotton's produced by 1.8 million African Americans who are slaves, who are part of the 4 million African Americans who were slaves in the 1850s and into the 1860s in the Civil War. Those 4 million African Americans were the most valuable commodity in the American economy. Them, their bodies, their flesh, their bones, their children, who they did not own because they were enslaved, and their children were automatically the property of the people who considered them property. They were the most valuable thing in the American economy, more than every factory in the north, every ship in every harbor. And yet they would have been of no value had they not been 3,000 miles away from Louisiana and the cotton valleys, the cotton producing valleys of the Mississippi Valley. They would have been worthless had it not been for what was happening in this country. Because what was happening in the Mississippi Valley was umbilically linked to what was happening in the Lancashire Valley, where 4,000 cotton mills produced the commodities, the clothes and the yarn that were Britain's biggest export. The Industrial Revolution wasn't just about iron and steel and railways, it was about cloth, it was about cotton. The Economist reckoned, the magazine that's still running today, reckoned that about 20% of the British population were to some degree economically dependent upon cotton. There's a point when you tell children every tiny detail of the most important industry and the most dynamic and significant point in British history, when you tell people every detail apart from one detail, when an omission stops becoming an omission and it becomes a lie. And my childhood, and the reason Peter Fry's book was so important, was because it made me realize I had been lied to. These weren't omissions, they weren't mistakes, they weren't things, oversights, they were lies. And we have lies about the place of black people in our country, all over the country, all over our history. It's in books, it's also imprinted on buildings. I live in Bristol. In Bristol and in other cities in Britain, we have heritage plaques that will describe somebody as a West India planter. What does that mean? It's a meaningless phrase. It's a heritage industry invention. West India planter means plantation owner, and to be a plantation owner is to be a slave owner. Other heritage plaques will describe people as West India merchants. That doesn't mean anything. It's a euphemism. It's a way of concealing and whitewashing our past. A West India merchant is a slave trader. The Dictionary of National Biography has been complicit for years in this. There are families who have redacted the slave part of their history. And that's been repeated and regurgitated in the Dictionary of National Biography and in Who's Who and in all sorts of publications, where that element of their story has been elided, it's been forgotten, it's been disguised. It happens over and over again. And so if you're a young black kid growing up in the north of England, you don't understand where you fit into all of this. The same is true of the story of empire, the story of how my Nigerian father happened to be in Britain, why I'm sitting here speaking in English, why my ancestors encountered the British when they arrived in the 1850s in gunboats in the lagoons of Lagos. Part of studying black history is always going to be about discovering and uncovering and confronting fabrications, omissions, and sometimes the word has to be lies. But the reason that I wrote the book was not just about wanting to confront those falsehoods. It was also because of a perhaps naive but I think important belief that Britain can become a country that confronts all of our histories, that looks at the role that it played in the world, the role at the center of the biggest empire the world has ever seen, and confronts it. I do think that we are capable of becoming the country that is able to explain all of the reasons why all of us are here, why the faces looking at me look the way they do, why our stories and our family histories and our national histories are the way they are. I do think we're capable of becoming the country that will acknowledge those histories. It's going to take a long time. I think it's our younger people are going to be the key, not my generation. But I do think we'll get there. And I think it's important we get there, not just because I think we're capable of doing it, but because there is no country in the world less capable, less viable at having a history that doesn't acknowledge its global role than Britain. There is no country whose global thumbprint has been more indelibly marked on more continents and more people and more people's stories than Britain. This is a country that has a strange relationship with its past. We often talk about the empire. We know that 44% of people, according to a YouGov poll, think the empire is something to be proud about. And yet, many of those same people who feel proud about the empire have a sort of insular, isolationist, little Britain view of the world. The empire is the story of Britain. It's not an external story. It's not an additional story, a nice to have extra chapter at the end of the real stuff about the Tudors and that sort of stuff. It's integral. And no country has been more global than Britain. One of the ways historians like to talk about that is you take the example of our national drink, which for the moment is still tea. It's not yet cheap supermarket lager, but give it a while. Well, as you all know, tea doesn't grow in Yorkshire or Lancashire. Tea's from China. But the British, when the British encountered the Chinese, the British weren't able to convince the Chinese to sell it to the British traders because we had nothing they wanted to buy. British ships arrived in China in the 16th century and 17th century full of our main export at the time, wool. Really hard to sell wool to people who are wearing silk. But the British liked tea so much that we found a way of having a supply of it, which was of growing it in India. By the 19th century, about 1 million people were growing tea in India and Sri Lanka just for export to Britain. I have there skipped over the story of the Opium Wars, which is the other way Britain got tea out of China, but it's a nice evening. Let's not go there. Tea comes from China. We grew it in India, but the British, unlike the Chinese and unlike the Indians at the time, we discovered a taste for having tea that was sweetened, and we sweetened it with cane sugar. Now, cane sugar comes originally from New Guinea. The British didn't encounter it in Asia, they encountered it in the Americas, in Brazil, where it was being grown by the Portuguese. And the British learned from the Portuguese the very complicated methods of both growing and processing cane sugar, one of the hardest crops to grow, one of the most complicated proto-industrial crops to process from the raw cane into something approaching what we understand today as sugar. But the British didn't just learn from the Portuguese, it transplanted those methods onto the islands of the Caribbean, where, of course, inevitably, as you all know, the key ingredient was forced slave labor of Africans. So what you have in the 18th century is you have an Asian crop being grown on the islands of the Americas by Africans for consumption in Europe. And because we're used to this idea, we sometimes forget how just mental it is. It's worth saying it again. It's an Asian crop being grown in the Americas by African slave labor for consumption in Europe. And when we consumed it in Europe, we consumed it in crockery and cups and saucers that we called then and we still call China, because it came from China. The cup of tea is the ultimate symbol of British globalism, and yet we've seen it as this domestic symbol of Britishness. It is quintessentially British because it is global. Historians used to say that the only thing British in a cup of tea was the milk. Well, the problem with that is that cows are Dutch. So even that's up for debate. Britain is a quintessentially global nation. Our encounters with peoples all over the world is not an additional chapter to British history. It is British history. When I was at school, I was taught 2 courses in A-level history. There was European history and there was British history. That was it. You was either British or was European. The rest of the world didn't have a look in. 2 separate courses, 2 separate teachers, 2 separate exams. You could pass one, you could fail the other. The empire, the rest of the world, the parts of the world that made Britain rich, they didn't come into it. And yet I passed A-level history. I went on to university. I chose my university on the basis of being able to study more broadly, because of our myopia about what is British history. You cannot have a country that rules over the biggest empire the world has ever seen and then talk about British history as a domestic story that we can all sit under oak trees reading Chaucer and drinking mead. It's a fantasy. And it's an important fantasy to confront because, as Stuart Hall, the great British Jamaican thinker, once said, is that you cannot understand British history without its global dimensions. He rather brilliantly said, "We are here because you were there." I exist. I'm a product of the empire, entirely a product of the empire. My father is Nigerian. My mother is British. My father met my mother in Newcastle University. Newcastle University was an offshoot of Durham University. Durham University was connected to the missionaries, and the missionaries, the LMS and the CMS, went to Sierra Leone in Nigeria, where they set up the Anglican Church. The first bishop of Lagos, Samuel Ajay Crowther, had been taken off a slave ship, brought up in Freetown, Sierra Leone, educated by the Church Mission Society. He'd gone back to Lagos and established the cathedral on Lagos Island, where my father was buried. You can walk down around Freetown in Sierra Leone, and you can walk down a series of streets that are named after successive 19th century British prime ministers. To be a Creole in Freetown, Sierra Leone, or to be somebody who goes to an Anglican church in Lagos is to be as British as anybody in Brixton or as Bradford or Birmingham. Britishness cannot be defined just within these islands. That's the consequence of having an empire. We are here because you are there. And I find when I talk about this, there are people who are threatened by this. This is wonderful. This explains why we're here. This explains the country that we are, and it explains and I think offers the seed of the country that we could be if we can confront our history, be honest about our history, and be honest in our unveiling of everybody's stories, family histories, and roots through that history. But there is a resistance. There is a sense that British history is an insular story that can only be told within the confines of these islands. And I wrote this book to try to challenge that idea. But this book ends with a moment, well, two moments that I think are really important. And they're the story of two Olympic Games. There's the Olympic Games of 1948 and the Olympic Games of 2012. Now, you'll remember 2012 better, I'm guessing. It's really strange to think that was only 6 years ago. If you remember that opening ceremony, within that pageant that was a celebration of British history, alongside the Jarrah March, the foundation of the NHS, the suffragettes, the First World War, alongside those icons, uncontested icons of British history, was another story, the arrival of the Windrush. And a ersatz, fake, reconstructed Windrush made out of metal frames covered in material was carried around the Olympic Stadium by 21st century Londoners dressed in the sort of 1940s suits of their ancestors with pork pie hats and battered leather suitcases. And it was at that moment that the Windrush story, the foundational story of post-war migration, in that case West Indian, but it's become more than that. It's come to stand for all of us whose ancestors came to this country in that period, that became part of British history. And if you remember the rest of the ceremony, the opening ceremony, there was loads of kind of kids. It was about what it was to be young in Britain. These mixed race London kids of all races, about their lives in the most diverse multicultural city in the world. That feels a long time ago. It's only 6 years. It doesn't quite feel the Britain that we're living in now. But it's strange when you think about that Olympic Games compared to the previous time that Britain had held the Olympic Games, which was 1948, 6 weeks before the Windrush arrived. Now that Britain, that London, that stadium into which those games were performed, if you look at the old film, you'll see a London that is almost entirely white. There were probably about 6,000 black Londoners, but they're not in the Wembley Stadium for the 1948 Games. There are black athletes, but they are from colonial countries, and when they win medals, the national anthem that's played is God Save the King, and the flag that's raised is the Union flag, because they don't have nations. When Arthur wins the 400 meters, the flag that is raised is not that of Jamaica, his home, but of the empire of which he is part. But when you think about those two Olympic Games, it's important to remember how unimaginable the world of 2012, even though I worry we've wandered from that idealistic moment of 2012, how unimaginable that is to somebody sitting in the stadium in 1948 with most of the empire still intact, with the idea that the empire in some form can limp on and continue, with the idea of racial hierarchies undermined by the battle of against Nazism, but not erased, not fully contested, not discredited as it should have been. The journey from the London of 1948 to the London of 2012 is an important one, and it's one that, to our terrible risk, we don't fully acknowledge. We have come an incredibly long way, but there's still a really long way to go. I will just keep going on, so I should take some questions, because I do a 2-hour version of this talk, and I'm really good at answering questions, and I love answering questions. It stops me just gibbering on. So Anyone got any good questions? Come on. I'll pick somebody out. I'll be unfair. Please shout.
I just wanted to know why you think British history's been sort of watered down, as you said. Just asking why you think British history has been watered down, or who's to blame? Is it something? Is it a decision someone made at some point, just carried on, or?
That's a good question. I think there's lots of decisions they're made sometimes subconsciously, sometimes consciously. I think there was a very deliberate decision made by thousands of families and by the government and by political parties to whitewash slavery from British history. Because by the battle against slavery was so bitterly contested that the abolitionists and who were both black and white, and the people in the Caribbean who were contesting against slavery violently, because that was the only means they had, what they did was they highlighted the moral bankruptcy of the slave system. And so those people who got rich from it, they wanted to rewrite their family histories, to take those chapters out of their family histories and conceal them. And family after family did this. One of the I think most interesting families is the Blair family, and it's not the Blair you think. It's the other Blair, Eric Blair, who's George Orwell. George Orwell's great grandfather had been a slave owner and a plantation owner in the Caribbean. When money fell out of slavery, which is a little bit before abolition, it's one of the reasons abolition happened, because the economics of slavery in Jamaica, though not everywhere, was beginning to be undermined by erosion of soil, by competition. The Blair family moved to other parts of the empire. So Blair's father was a farmer in India, but he was a very specific sort of farmer. He grew opium for the British government. I said I wasn't going to get onto this, but I have. He grew opium for the British government for what was incredibly and unashamedly and openly called the Opium Department, that dumped hundreds of tons of opium on the Chinese, leading to the two opium wars, the destruction of the Summer Palace in the 1840s, some of the worst vandalistic crimes of the British Empire. Now, George Orwell, was followed in the family tradition. He became a policeman in Burma. He bought into the imperial project, but there was something kind of wrong in his family sense with George Orwell, because he rebelled brilliantly, violently, emotionally against the imperial project, and he wrote his book Burmese Days about what it was like to be a colonial policeman in Burma, and then he went on to write his great books and become the journalist that he became. One of the few people to actually understand the hypocrisy of fighting against Nazism while maintaining an empire based on racial hierarchies. The Orwell family, George Orwell once described Britain as a rich family sitting around the dinner table and no one wanted to talk about where the money came from. And he was absolutely right. And he wrote that about Britain, but he also knew it literally about his own family. So the Orwell family, like thousands of British families, wrote this chapter out of their history. So there has been a sort of deliberate effort at rewriting, but that was assisted enormously by the story of abolition. We have this wonderful story in which we look good. The story of abolition is used instead of the story of slavery. We talk about the moment of abolition instead of the moment of the formation of the slave trade. Most people can mention an abolitionist, William Wilberforce being the most famous. Very few people can mention a slave trader. When I'm criticized, as I often am, for banging on about things like slavery and colonization, the scramble for Africa, colonial genocide, when people say, stop talking about slavery, you're always talking about slavery. All we ever hear is about slavery. I always say, well, if you know so much about it, because of people like me banging on about it, name a slave trader, name a slave ship, name a plantation. Nobody can. Because we don't know very much about it. Like we don't know very much about the scramble for Africa. We don't know very much about the crimes that Britain conducted in India. We know about the reaction to the so-called Indian Mutiny, though it's not called that in India, believe me. We know a little bit about it, but we don't talk about it. One of the ways of silencing non-white people is to say, you're going on about it too much. We've heard it all before. You're saying the same stuff. It's a very powerful way of shutting people up, of saying you're enough already. So I think that the disguising, the camouflaging of parts of British history has been achieved by accentuating other. We tell the story of abolition and not the story of slavery. And that's like trying to say that you understand War and Peace because you read the last chapter. And that's why we have this knowledge deficit about the empire. And as much as, I disagree with the 44% of people who think the empire is something we should feel active pride in, I don't think we're in a position, or most people are in a position, to say whether they feel pride or shame or whether they should feel those extreme emotions about the empire, because I don't think we talk about it enough in any way. I don't think we have enough information taught in schools, in the public conversation, for us to make rational decisions about whether the empire was a good thing or a bad thing. I've made up my mind, but I think we need more conversation before we have decision-making and the apportioning of blame or praise. That was a good question. Any others? There's another one there.
Testing. You said that you thought since 2012, it's deteriorated a lot, our position. And I wondered, to your mind, what the kind of imperative for that decline has been.
Well, I think part of what we've declined from since 2012 is a lot of people, we really wanted to believe what we saw at the 2012 Olympics. So in some way, we've declined from a moment of optimism rather than a moment of realism. I sat down to watch that opening ceremony in a very, very British way, presuming it was going to be crap. Which is a sensible position to normally take. But I presumed we were going to make an absolute dick of ourselves in front of the entire world, and it was going to be embarrassing. Now, if you remember the closing ceremony of the Beijing Olympics, in which Britain announced itself as the place that was going to carry the Olympic flame, that did involve Boris Johnson. So I was already worried that we had form here in making embarrassing public statements about the Olympics. So I watched it expecting it to be rubbish. And like a lot of people, I found myself instead in tears and very moved. Now, unfairly, they played Jerusalem, which is an easy way to get people to blub. So it wasn't entirely, it was slightly underhand. But it portrayed a Britain that I wanted to believe we'd become. And a lot of people wanted to believe that this pageant of inclusivity and involvement was really where we were. Somebody pointed out to me at the time that it was the London Olympics, not the British Olympics. But if you want to know why things have changed, I think the answer has got to be Brexit.
You look so lonely up there, David.
No longer. Afua Hirsch, everybody. Well, I've been hogging the time. So that's why you should buy Afua's book.
I have a really good excuse for being late. I had a chance to meet Oprah and give her a copy of British, which I did. And she gave me some amazing advice, which if anyone is interested, ask and I'll share it. But I'm so sorry I'm late. And under any other circumstances, I would not have been. But I hope you understand.
That's a pretty good
It was
excuse.
really tough. It was like David, Oprah. David, Oprah.
I would have gone Oprah.
It was quite a dilemma.
So, I've had the floor to myself. So
Have you been taking questions?
I have, yeah.
Okay, so can I take a question? Isn't anyone going to ask me what Oprah's advice was? Oh, okay. Okay. My book, Brit-ish, is about Britishness and identity. And it is, thank you so much. It's really the product of my life's work and curiosity, really, first of all, trying to understand my own life and my own reluctance to own my Britishness, because I'm a British person. I've never been anything other than a British person. But I always felt like my Britishness was qualified and questioned, and that I had to explain it, and that my ability to have it was conditional on good behavior, gratitude, downplaying my otherness. And I think, like so many people who experienced that, I didn't have the tools to understand it. I didn't look for it. It found me. My parents both have never had the experience of having an identity that they felt was othered in the same way that I did. So I set out to understand it without even knowing that's what I was doing. In my life, I studied the empire and the fall of the empire. I lived and worked in Africa several times. I've lived in so many different countries. And the more I went around looking for a place where I felt I could fully belong, the more British I felt, which was such a conundrum given that the whole point of that project was not feeling British. I worked as a reporter and a barrister on social injustice, trying to understand what I could clearly see was structural types of unfairness and disadvantage in this country and where they came from. And that information wasn't easily accessible to me. I think things were often presented in a very ahistorical way. So I set about understanding it myself. And that's what I've been doing my whole adult life. And this book is the product of that work. So it's partly a personal book because the real reason I wrote it was for the younger me. I wanted the younger me going through what I went through to have something that spoke to them. And I knew that only by telling parts of my own story could I do that. And that was a difficult thing to do. And David and I have talked about this because his book has some personal detail as well. And actually that really touched me reading your story. And we have different stories. And it helped me understand the context for your work and your scholarship. So I do tell some personal stories, but I also tell other people's stories. And I want to be part of a progress in which we understand there's not a single narrative. I'm not the spokesperson for all people of colour or all mixed race people. But I think there are many things that other people from all different backgrounds can relate to in that search for belonging and search for an identity. So I approach it in the book from different perspectives. There is a chapter about history and our relationship to it and how it informs our sense of identity. There is a chapter about sex and ideas about the body and perceptions of sexuality and romance, which I think in some ways are one of the last areas where some quite toxic historical concepts have been driven underground and still flourish and thrive in ways I found quite shocking. If you read the book, I had some shocking experiences in researching it. And I also talk about mixed race as a phenomenon that has its own narrative around it. I look at film and literature and music, art, at immigration and the politics of identity, Brexit, the criminal justice system. So it's quite wide-ranging, but the thread that runs through it is understanding my own identity and the ways in which identity affects our social reality today. So I hope that gives you an overview of my book. Would anyone like to ask anything about it?
If not, we could slip into in conversation.
Yeah, we could.
As built.
We could. Did you get loads of questions? Should I be offended?
I got a couple.
Oh, thank you. I was just kidding. Yes.
Questions here.
Hello. Oh, okay. I'm so glad someone asked, Ron. I asked Oprah, so it was the launch of A Wrinkle in Time, which is this film directed by Ava DuVernay. And there was a panel with Reese Witherspoon and Ava and Oprah. And it was a really kind of good vibes panel. So I, being the journalist, asked the more difficult question about the fact that we live in very toxic and very divisive times. And whether we can achieve progress by doing what I often do, which is engaging. And it's always such a joy to be in a conversation that isn't like this. A lot of the time, instead of sitting with someone like David, I'm sitting with someone who doesn't disagree with my arguments, but disagrees with my right to have an argument. At least that's how it feels. It can be very toxic. And I sometimes you couldn't be that hostile even if you tried. And I think the dilemma I have is whether by engaging with that argument, it's actually helping because I'm able to put my voice and the voices of other people who relate to me, or whether I'm being complicit in something which essentially doesn't have a place in modern discourse. Whether I'm feeding into this false equivalence that if you have someone who's overtly racist, that's an opinion that can then be countered with someone who's not racist. Racism is not an opinion. I don't think that it should be treated like an opinion that deserves to be countered every time somebody says something progressive. So that's the dilemma I have. So I asked Oprah whether she felt we should engage in those very hostile spaces or whether we should just break away and do our own thing and create our own thing and not complain about it and not critique it, but just move away and build our own narratives and our own organizations or our own production companies, as David has done. And she said to me, you have to go in there. If you know yourself, know your role. If your role is to be in there, go in there. But you have to be spiritually strong. And she said, you have to build spiritual muscle. You have to be spiritually ripped. And that is something I am going to... And Oprah has a way of talking directly to you. Like, she spoke like she knew me and my personal struggle. And this was advice especially for me. And when I saw her again, she said, spiritually ripped. So I'm taking that, and I hope you take something from that. And then I feel a little bit less guilty about being late.
I'm going to get down to spiritual gym. The
spiritual gym, spiritual circuits, spiritual weights. There's so many ways you could use this analogy. So I found that she's quite an incredible person, and her presence is really remarkable. And I'm quite difficult to impress, I think. So I was really impressed. So oh, okay, yes.
But you ought to know that you've made it safer for many of us to speak about things, because now when I say something and someone counters it, I can refer to you.
Oh.
And I can say, well, she also said that.
That's
and
lovely.
Just so many other examples that you've been tutoring about.
Thank you so much. That really means a lot to me. And I've taken a lot of inspiration from David as well. And having that scholarship and having a historian who's done the work and set out in such phenomenal detail and meticulously researched and beautifully written, I think it gives us all an intellectual self-confidence that, if you doubt me, go and read his book. It's there. I'm not making this up. And I think that, we build on each other, and that's what feels different now. I think we're starting to get a critical mass where there are books and there are scholars and there are TV presenters and there are academics and social historians, and where it's not just one lone person being so vulnerable to that attack. Although I would like greater numbers. So keep rising up, everyone. Yes.
I'd just like to ask, what are the sacrifices both of you had to make to write those histories? Because for me, it's always been, well, white people write the history, that's why I'm not in it. So the more of us that can write our own history, the more visible we become. And also, how much longer do you think that will take to get into our schools? Because unless it's taught in schools, I'm a teacher and I try to do bits and pieces, but as long as it's officially taught in schools, properly, rightly, and honestly, I don't think there will be any change.
Shall I? I will, yeah. It's how long, to paraphrase, when are we going to have our histories written? When are they going to be in the schools? And what are the costs of creating these histories? Is that fair paraphrasing? Yeah. To speak personally, what I think it's important that I do as an historian is that it's not about writing a separate, parallel Black British history that runs parallel to the mainstream but doesn't really feed into it. It's about showing that Black British history is British history. Yeah. It's not a nice to have, an additional chapter, a little bit of literal colour. It is British history. In the end of the 18th century, the biggest issue in Britain was slavery. It was the issue that elections were being fought of. It was ripping the ruling elite apart. The biggest issue in Britain in the 1880s was whether Britain was going to take part in the scramble for Africa and dominate it and take possession of this new continent that was going to feed the world and dominate the world's resources and minerals. In the late 16th century, Africa was the obsession of people in this city. Look at the number of Africans in Shakespeare's plays that were performed in a theatre a mile from where we're sitting that was called The Globe. A globalized view. Look at the medal that Drake was given by Elizabeth, again a mile from where we're sitting. The Drake medal that shows a black figure, Cimarron, who was an escaped slave from the Spanish Empire, who were the allies of the British in their wars. Their piracy is probably more accurate, against the Spanish Empire. Black people, their status, their humanity, the wealth of the continent from which we come have repeatedly been the biggest story. They've dominated parts of British history. This just cannot be marginal. What is the biggest issue now? It's immigration. What was the Italian election last week about? It was about immigration. What was Brexit really about? is about immigration. These aren't marginal issues, they're central. So for me, showing that Black history is British history, that there's no point lying to children to telling them about every detail of the mills of Lancashire without saying where the cotton came from. That's as essential as telling. And that's not to say that telling stories about Equiano, telling stories that are for Black History Month is not essential. This book was supposed to be called, before I was outvoted by someone on a higher pay scale, it was supposed to be called A Black History of Britain, which was my preferred title. And that's the mission statement. It's a Black history of Britain, but it is a history of Britain.
Can I add something that's not that positive, but it's real? It happened to me today and it's on my mind. Today, for reasons that will become clear in a couple of months, I hijacked a London bus tour for tourists. So it
Who
was.
got you to do that?
Oh, I could just. Who would think of such a thing? So I'm making a documentary with David for his production company, and we're looking at ways of changing the historical narrative, changing the way people perceive history. So, these tours go around central London and they're like, here's Napier, here's Churchill, here's Nelson. And it's all very kind of light and lovely. So I got the mic, some poor unsuspecting tourists. And I told a slightly different version. Here's Clive of India, an unstable sociopath who drained Bengal and became the self-made richest man in Europe at Bengal's expense. It was kind of like that. And it was really interesting. So there were quite a diverse group. There were some sixth formers on the bus. There were some tourists. There were some older people. And at the end, I spoke to people about what they thought. And I spoke to these two young women of colour. And one of them was almost crying. And she said, it is so profound to hear those things because we know they're there, but no one tells us them. We have to fill in the gaps. We're having to constantly question ourselves for what we know to be true because it's erased and it affects our sense of self. I don't feel like I'm part of this country because I don't see myself reflected in it. And it was very emotional for them. And then I spoke to two older white people from outside London who said, that was really interesting. It was interesting, but, I don't think it really belongs on a tour. It's just, and it really got to me because I've been thinking that what we need to do is change the narrative and put these facts out there. And I passionately believe that. But today I saw that these ideas are so ingrained that even when you do it, people don't embrace them psychologically. And there seemed like a lack of empathy to me, and that, between those perspectives, these young women who were so personally affected and these other people who just saw it as, kind of interesting but not hugely relevant facts. So I don't know the answer. I don't know what you think, David, but it was quite sobering for me. And it gave me a sense of the gap. I think there is a real conflict in the way people perceive the importance of this.
I think there is, but I'm often surprised. I don't mean to, what you said entirely valid. I don't want to saccharine cover it with sort of optimism, but I have moments when my expectations are confounded. And I remember a few years ago I was on a beach in the south of England, and there was a guy who's probably in his late 50s, and he had bulldogs and St. George's flags on his tattoos on his chest. And I did what I did when I was a teenager, and I was nervous of him, and I recalled, and I was kind of in my early 40s. But the sort of training that these are the people who are dangerous to you, which I had learned growing up as a mixed race kid in the north of England, kind of just kicked in, and I sort of took the sort of the breathing in you do when you think this is somebody who's hostile to you. And then his little mixed race daughter ran out of the sea and said, "Granddaddy." And I thought, God, the journey that guy's been on. And there are a lot of people who I think are fortunate enough, because what happens is that their families force them to confront those old ideas, those comfortable ideas. My father-in-law, when he was a young man, used to knock around and go to things that Enoch Powell went to. He had two daughters, one married a Spaniard, the other married a Nigerian Geordie. He's had to accommodate quite a lot of ideas. And there are a lot of people who've gone on these journeys and who've done so, I think, quite remarkably. And I think there's some people who might be influenced by a book that I might write or Afua might write, but there's some people who will really be influenced by having a mixed race granddaughter. When I look at young people, when I talk to them about their attitudes to race, that's when I'm really hopeful. And I try to talk to them more than I talk to the kind of old people who,
That's also good advice.
yeah,
Although
talk to young people.
Do you know, it's not an exaggeration to describe him as a fan. There's a man who comes to a lot of my events. I don't think he's here. I haven't seen him, but he comes to a lot of my events. He is in his 70s. He's a former senior military leader, very posh, from aristocratic descent. He wears tweeds. He loves my book. And every time I see him, he says to me, keep doing what you're doing. It's wonderful. And I have to say, the first time I saw him at one of my events, I was like, here we go. I wasn't expecting him to be an ally. He is a serious ally. And it's really remarkable. And, I think the experience of putting this book into the world has forced me to confront some of my own prejudices. And I fully admit that. And, I tell people to confront their prejudices and their baggage. So it's important that I do it as well. So you find allies in unlikely places. And it's very important not to judge people. And I think we all do it. And we all could do less of it. Yes. Yes. This lady. Yes. Yeah. Hello.
Okay, first of all, I just want to say I haven't read both of your books yet, but excellent concept and context, etc. What I really wanted to ask about was the concept of the term British. For me, as a Trinidadian who arrived here in the 70s, I'm not British, I'm a Trinidadian and a migrant, but I've always found the word to have a very subtle context of otherness. I'll say this because when my mother arrived here in the 70s, she was at some sort of tea party or something, and she was with a friend who's dual heritage. And my mother and my mother's friend were talking to someone. My mother's talking to an elderly English woman who essentially, is this on?
You don't need it.
So, okay.
You've got such a good speaking voice. You really don't.
To an elderly English woman, and the woman said to my mother, "Where are you two from?" And my mother said, "Well, I'm from Trinidad, and my friend is English." And this woman said, "Oh no, she's British." Now, the way I look at the term British, it embodies imperialism, colonialism, and it makes a distinction between those who are seen as being of this soil, i.e. English, code white, and us, i.e. everyone else who doesn't fit into the category of English. So I'm just wondering, and I like the context of your British, I think that actually puts a question in there. I'm just wondering if you would consider also looking at how we could address this, because I would say, even the term black is problematic for me. I see it as a colour or political statement. I see myself as being of African heritage. So I would prefer African English, actually, if we were looking at it that way. And I'm just wondering what you think. There you go.
I like Afro-Saxon. Have you heard that one? That's a good one. I think this is a genuinely fascinating question. And like you, I've heard that. And during the Brexit debate, I noticed a kind of commentary where they were speaking to people in Brexit heartlands of England, and people were saying, anyone can be British. We're not British. British is anyone can be British. We're the English, and we are a people, and we are indigenous, and this is our country. And it was being expressed very much in racial terms of whiteness, of being indigenous, of kind of tribal ethnicity. And I hadn't articulated that about Englishness. I knew Englishness was more excluding than Britishness to me personally, but I hadn't really understood the ethnic connotations so clearly until the Brexit vote. And I think if you ask those people why they reject Britishness, they feel it's a political invention to accommodate the empire and the Commonwealth. And that's why people describe themselves as Black British or British Asian, because they are former imperial subjects or the descendants of them who have those British identities, but that Britishness doesn't actually exist in a kind of emotional ethnic sense. It's a political project, but the real identities are English, Scottish, Welsh, Northern Irish, although Northern Ireland is so much more complicated. So that's a separate thing. Yeah, well, separate thing. But I'm not going there. But it is interesting, of all the parts of the UK that I've spoken about identity, Northern Ireland is the one place I've never had to justify being interested in identity. People know how important identity is as part of your visceral, daily, emotional, lived experience. But I think that's true. And I think I've never lived in any part of the UK other than England, but I have never described myself as English. And I don't feel bad saying this because I've confronted him about it in person, but Ben Fogle put out a book last year called The English. And he basically defined Englishness as somebody who likes walking in wellies, owns a Labrador, drives a Range Rover and eats cream tea, which I was wondering if he's ever met a working class English person, let alone person of colour. There's not one person of colour in his book. He went to Harrogate, he went to Morecambe, he went to Henley, and he, without having thought about it, described a white identity. And when I asked him about it, he was like, that never occurred to me. Yeah, I guess I didn't speak to any people of colour. And it didn't give him any kind of, there was nothing to trigger that sense that was problematic. So I do think, and somebody published that book and put it out there, and it's selling very well. So I think that's true. And probably not in London either, to be fair. But I think that is real, that sense of Englishness still as an exclusive tribal identity. And that's actually one reason that I think Cheddar Man was so interesting, because that kind of stakes a nail into the heart of that narrow version of Englishness, which I personally really enjoyed. I don't know if it showed, but I did enjoy
I think one of
it.
the useful things to do when people talk about an Anglo-Saxon identity, which is ethnically British, is to ask them to show you where on the map of England Saxony is and how they're indigenous people and yet from Germany. Bit of a problem with that approach. But like Afua, I don't describe myself as English because I don't feel invited to. And I think Britishness is quite useful because I think it has been a sort of useful, it's kind of invented by the Romans. So it's invented by our occupiers, which is rather useful. It's an organizational principle for the island, for the province of Britannia. It's an externally applied label, which I think has been really useful because I think it is more inclusive than Englishness. I think Britishness is more malleable to becoming an identity that's not racialized than Englishness, which seems to be becoming more racialized. And I see that in my relationship to the Union flag and the flag of St. George. And I'm much, much more comfortable than I used to be with the Union flag. And when Linford Christie, it's a long time ago now, wrapped himself in the Union flag, and that felt great. It felt an act of detoxification. I find the St. George's flag, in a way I really wish I didn't, much more problematic. And I really want to embrace the idea of Englishness and those symbols of Englishness. The comforting thing is, of course, thinking about who St. George was, and that really helps, given that he was Turkish, Palestinian, Syrian. So obviously a great symbol of people in Essex who hate black people. He's your perfect. When you're thinking about your ancestors from Saxony and your saint who's from Syria, it's really helpful.
I know Lola's got a question there, but can I just ask David something first quickly? I just want to ask you something, two kind of related things. One, this whole project of talking about identity has made me question the whole concept of patriotism, because I've always approached it as I should feel British and I don't, so there's something that's gone wrong, that's a disconnect, that's made me feel excluded. But a lot of people have responded by saying that they don't think nationalism is healthy anyway, that they don't think it's good to have a sense of national identity and that it's an advantage not to have one. So I'm curious what you think about that. And the second related question is, you talked about Linford Christie and the Union Jack. When Colin Kaepernick was taking a knee in the US in protest of Black Lives Matter and Trump's discourse around race, I thought about our national treasures, especially our athletes, because the athletics and sport is one of the few places where we really celebrate people of colour, right? And we don't question their Britishness. Mo Farah was Somali until he started winning medals, and then he was British all the way. But it's inconceivable to me that he would feel able to mount the same kind of protest. It feels to me like in this country, if you're accepted as a national treasure, as a symbol of patriotism, you do not challenge it. And as far as I can think, there's no precedent for somebody given that access to say, I'm actually going to challenge it. It's almost like you have to be a good immigrant if you're in that position. We're not secure enough to break the rules. And I'm just curious what you think about that too.
Well, I think, the classic example is, could you have a British Muhammad Ali? Could you have a black Briton who would reject conscription into the army, challenge national foreign policy, and convert to Islam, and still be a national hero? I think you'd struggle.
What does that say about us?
That we're less secure. I think what the Brexit thing has thrown up is the power of the idea of silencing, that you're accepted as long as you... A lot of societies, and there's a lot of political systems have talked about this, about active citizens and passive citizens, and that to be an immigrant is to be tolerated. It's not to be an active citizen who can participate. It's to be someone who's tolerated. One of the difficult conversations to have is that I'm not a Gastarbeiter. I haven't come here to be tolerated. I am British, and I claim Britishness without the brackets as a political act, because I don't think Britishness can be restricted to the stories and the lives just within the confines of these small islands. The consequence of having an empire is you have exported your identity. You have diluted your identity. And we are the product of it. And we are here, and we aren't going anywhere. This is my country as much as it's yours. And I really want to... I call myself British, not black British, but British. And I do it deliberately and consciously and purposefully.
Really interesting. Can I said I'd take that question. Lola,
Once.
and then...
Okay, so I sort of have 2 parts. I'm going backwards. Afua knows me. Thank you. And my parents are Nigerian. I was born and raised in London, and I've lived in New York for the past 11 years. On the subject of Englishness versus Britishness, when you go abroad, Britishness is not a thing. Like, I'm English as far as everyone's concerned. That's the black English girl. I'm like, no, I'm not really English though. And they're like, but you are. I'm like, no. And I'm, okay, it's a whole thing to get into, but it's just interesting stepping outside of Britain. British versus English is not a thing. You're English as far as other people are concerned. It's also very interesting, and this is a question. So from an American perspective, obviously the past 11 or so years, Black Lives Matters, all the police brutality. I mean, there's a massive conversation in the US around race, identity, what it means to be American, and so on and so forth. Whenever I come back here, I always find the UK a bit backwards in its discussions about race and identity. And it's really heartwarming to see Afua and David doing their thing. I wonder if it's something to do with British politeness and the way that we discuss and have conversations with each other that make it harder to move these conversations forward. Number one, I'd be interested in your perspective on that. And number two, the fact that the US has had segregation and a civil rights movement over a long period of time means that there was a long period in which it really, people had to figure out what identity really meant. And I'm quite interested in how the UK does that. I'm not saying there should be segregation or a civil rights movement, but how it does that when it doesn't have the sort of schism whereby, two camps kind of get into their headspace and go, who are we and what are we about? So those are basically my thoughts, and I'd like to hear what you think.
Thank you very much, Lola. They're really interesting points. I think that I definitely agree that they're part of this, and it may be a small part, but it is a part, and I write about it in my book, is there is a British awkwardness. British people are quite socially awkward, let's face it, and we tiptoe around things, and we code everything, and we fluff things up. You know this. Anytime you go to a foreign country and you try and translate, would you mind terribly if I possibly had an X? And like other languages don't work like that. It's like, give me X. I was in Berlin on Friday and I was trying to think in German, and it's like, you cannot translate English into German because they do not think the same way. They just say, give it to me. Thank you. Or maybe not thank you. They don't say sorry every 5 minutes. We're British, we're very awkward. We're always apologizing and we're coding everything. So that is part of it, I think. And also, you're spot on. We've not had a civil rights movement. We've not had a moment where race was front and center of the political existential consciousness of the country. And in a way, America had to get to rock bottom in its kind of racism and white supremacism and legalized segregation for that to happen. So I'm not romanticizing the fact that America had to go so low to make that a political debate that was mainstream. But the flip side is that we have been very complacent, I believe. We often compare ourselves to countries like America and be like, we never had segregation. We're not racist. We're fine. We don't need an Obama. We're post-racial already. And we're not. We've never confronted the fallout of empire. We've never confronted 400 years of an overtly white supremacist project that was based on the idea of the British being a superior race that had the right to take away the self-determination of other people, of other races. I mean, that's literally what the empire was. And we've never confronted it. We kind of cheered ourselves up that we let it go in a very civilized way. We were way better than the French and the Portuguese and the Belgians. And we were very humane and gentlemanly about letting these brown and black people have their own nations. And aren't we kind? Just like we congratulate ourselves for letting William Wilberforce end the transatlantic slave trade. And we happily paid compensation to the slave owners. And isn't everything wonderful? We've not had to confront these. And a lot of the reason for that, in my view, is the history of the 20th century, having won 2 world wars. We are a victorious nation. We are on the right side of history. Nothing has made us confront the times in which we were deeply on the wrong side of history. And I think if you look at a comparative perspective, that kind of makes sense. You know, Germans will tell you they would not have confronted the shame that they have if they hadn't lost the war. They had to be forced to do it. They had no choice. And they'll admit that. And we weren't forced to do it, and so we haven't. And my interest is how we can confront that and how we can move things on. But you can't move things on until you confront what has happened. You know, you can't be post-racial until you confront the racialized nature of your reality. And so I think you're right. And the question is, in the absence of, you know, structural segregation and a civil rights movement and losing a world war, none of which I would like to see in this country, how can we get there? And I think it just takes courage. And that's what I'm looking for.
Nothing to add.
Oh, okay.
My life, David Afua. So I want to ask one question before we kind of round this up. So Afua, I don't think Oprah answered your question to start off. I think your question was, you know, should you get involved? Should you not get involved? And she told you something different. But,
oh, sorry. Lola
did
was
you only
there.
give half the answer? Well, what's the other half then?
Oh, yeah. She said change the narrative. Yeah, but I kind of agree with Ron that in a way, that was the question. Like, do we go into hostile spaces and try and change narrative, or do we just wash our hands of them and just create our own? So I interpreted her answer as, only you can know what you need to do. Everyone has a role. Everyone has a role to play. Everyone has a strength. And, you know, there's no generic answer. Like, it might be some people's role to go into hostile spaces. And people often say to me, how do you keep your cool on The Pledge, the show I do on Sky News, when you've got 4 people coming at you trying to shut you down? And it's a really weird question, because in a way, I don't know the answer. I just do. So I hate to think that's my role in this world. I don't think that's my role in this world, to be the person that tolerates that. But there are things that come easily to me that wouldn't to another person. Sorry, yeah. But I think that she's saying that you've got your own personal boundaries and you need to have your... Well, okay, let me think. I mean, yes, in an ideal world, I would have liked to have given me an answer that I could just literally implement and follow. And like, this is what you should do. But I think that's maybe it was an unreasonable question. And the reason I ask this question is because young people come to me, this is important. Young people come to me and ask me this question: should I try and get a job at this major broadcaster or this newspaper? Should I try and, I see the coverage, it frustrates me. My voice isn't heard, my perspective isn't there. They're not covering these stories the way they should because people like me aren't in the room. Should I make my life project to be in the room? And I'm very ambivalent about how to answer that question because, one, yes, completely, we need that perspective in the room. We need diversity in our institutions. But on the other hand, do I want to take some young person brimming with energy and ideas and say, go into this toxic newsroom full of men who are going to shut you down and are not open to your ideas and that you're going to have to fight every day just for basic... Yeah, so this is where I'm defending Oprah. I think I would tap into who that person is and what their strengths are. And there are some people who I would say, do not go there. That's going to break you. You're going to lose everything you have to offer to this society, to this world. But there are other people who are really well equipped to go in there and they will change it. And one day they'll take it over and that's how you get progress. So there isn't a blanket answer. That is my genuine opinion. That's why what she said did resonate with me because it made me think that answer isn't outside of myself. And I don't want to sound really corny and American because we're British, we're British. But like those answers, in a way, only you have them. But I think the underlying ideology is a sense of purpose. If you have a sense of purpose and you have a sense of the progress you want to be part of, then you can start saying to yourself, this is where I want us as a community or as a society to get to. What's my role? What is my role? How can I make the most of my skills and my talent? And that's a different answer for everyone. And I'm not just saying that to defend Oprah, although I do now feel very defensive of Oprah.
So I'm going to say
Sorry.
Oprah is the oracle. So you have to figure it out
She
for
is
yourself.
literally the oracle.
She's the oracle. So figure it out. She'll give you a riddle, figure it out. And whenever you find the answer, that's what you need to do. So my question to both of you is, obviously British and Black and British. Why does it matter? Why is it important? What's the point? Is the question for both of you. So if you can both answer that, that'd be amazing.
To me, the point is that to remember what it's almost a definition to being a teenager is you don't know who you are. That is the defining feature of being young. And you're trying to construct an identity from all sorts of different fragments, which is why teenagers look so mental when they get dressed and wear such silly clothes, because you're trying to find all of these fragments. And when one of those fragments is whether you belong in your country, really big issue, whether you're accepted by your society, that's a really, really big gap to fill. And for me, it was filled by finding a book that showed I was part of a story. And as you know, I've been doing history a long time. All they are is our stories. That's all they are. They're the stories that we're all part of. You're just a tiny little flash in a long story. If that story has no place for you, then that's a really big deficit to expect young people to cope with. And we've failed. Usually we failed in that. I mean, the fact that we had to have an act of recovery, the fact that it took people like Peter Fry and Jim Walvin to create the first wave of Black British history. They had to go back in the archives and fill in the gaps. There was a book published in the 1990s about the 18th century that didn't mention slavery. It's like a book now that doesn't mention the internet. This, it's ridiculous. There was a book written about William Beckford of Fonthill, who wrote the great novel, the Gothic novel Vathek, who translated from Arabic some of the great Arab tales, who built Fonthill Abbey and Beckford Tower in Bath, and all of that was beautifully described. The fact that he was the biggest slave owner in the fucking world at the time wasn't mentioned. The fact that you could publish that book, make that program, and not say that is appalling. And I want to be part of a movement to make that impossible. I don't think anyone would publish those books now with those omissions. And it goes back to what I said earlier. There's a point when an omission becomes a lie. And as a historian, I just want to make it difficult to lie. That's all I'm trying to do.
Can I just say 2 words? Downton Abbey. I watched Downton Abbey, and at first I loved it. And then I was like, there's something missing. I can't work out what it is. So the late 19th century, early 20th century, the biggest political project of empire building this country has ever known. The most intense imperial propaganda, completely invisible. If you watch Downton, you'd think that was just, at best, a footnote. And we still do this. This is now. Go to the Royal Academy. There's an exhibition about Charles I. No reference. There's everything else. There's his wife, her Catholicism, how his narcissism and his art collection and his imperial self-styling as Caesar helped start the Civil War. No reference to the fact that this was the monarch that significantly intensified Britain's role in slave trading. That was a huge part of his legacy, not one mention. We're still repeating this day after day, and it is frustrating because it makes you question yourself. Am I imagining this? This is central. It's not a side note. It's not a footnote. It's not a Black History Month. It is, like David says, it's mainstream British history, and we're still erasing it. And I sometimes do just stop and think, how are our esteemed institutions, this huge global reputation for their intellectual prowess, and they're getting away with this, and we can't let them. And it's getting harder.
And there are more people on boards. And I think one of the problems is that it's the industries that are the liberal arts that have failed among the worst in diversity of voices and inclusion, both in terms of the people they publish and broadcast and the people choosing who gets published and broadcast. It's ironically the liberal left, the liberal institutions, the liberal arts that have failed more dramatically. I work in television. We ain't done great. So that's one of the problems. And I do think I see a change that might be long-lasting, or the beginnings of a change, more accurately, in those institutions.
Can we quickly take one more question? Because we promised this lady, and then you interrupted, Ron.
Go ahead.
Hi, Afua.
Hello.
What do you think about the financial compensation for enslavement and the legacy of enslavement? Because I think that's the only time when the whole issue is going to be taken seriously, when institutions have to pay for all the wrongs. Well, yeah, I think that's the only time. What do you think about it?
I don't think it's going to
about the practicalities.
That's all I can think of is the practicalities.
I have a view. It's about reparations. About reparations. About reparations for slavery, and should they be paid? I have a view on this. My senior politicians have told me, and this actually filled a big gap in the puzzle for me. Now, one of the reasons the British establishment is so intransigent when it comes to the simple act of acknowledging Britain's role in the slave trade, because don't forget, we have not had an official apology. We had this huge celebration of Wilberforce in 2007, the bicentenary of abolishing the trade. It was as if Britain had no role in creating the thing that needed to be abolished. It's this remarkable cognitive dissonance. I could never understand it. And these Blair-era politicians explained it to me. They said it's because of reparations. The fear of opening the door to a reparations movement that could have serious financial implications that no senior politician will acknowledge. They know, obviously, it's historical fact, but they can't admit it. And I found that really interesting because, one, it showed me the power of the reparations demand, that it strikes that fear into political leaders' hearts. But two, that it's kind of disabling the debate because no one will be honest because they're fearful of the financial consequences. I personally think that reparations should be paid, but if we got reparations today, what would we do with them? I think as a community, we don't have an ideology. We don't have a plan. We don't have the answers. We don't know, and the answers are out there, but we're not united around them. We don't have an ideological foundation for them that would allow us to use them strategically to change anything. And I think the worst case scenario would be we got reparations now and we weren't ready for them and we didn't use them to build something genuinely different. So I think that ideologically it's a very important campaign, but I think that if we got them now, I'd be very worried. I'd be very worried because you're only going to get that chance once.
It's more for a matter of acknowledgement, as far as I'm concerned. I think that it will force an acknowledgement, which will resonate in many, certainly through the education system and many others.
Yes, but the problem with reparations, the whole point is that it's painful, financially painful enough to change behaviour. And that's why it won't happen. And also that's why it creates fear. And yeah, till 2015.
That's only technocratically true. I think that was a really bizarre tweet. It's the complexities of long-term national debt are so boring and intricate that it's technocratically true, but it's, I think, more pertinently is, you know, I mean, Haiti is so poor because Haiti was paying back reparations to China until to France until the 1980s, because when the monarchs came back after the revolution, they sent gunboats to Haiti and demand that the Haitians pay reparations for themselves, for their act of stealing themselves from slavery. So we've had all forms of reparations.
Let's not forget that financial outflows from the African continent, including illegal tax evasion and multinational, especially British corporations extracting wealth, amount to $203 billion a year. And that exceeds aid into Africa by $40 billion a year. So the colonial pattern of exploitation is still completely alive and well. And I would like to see that linked with the reparations debate, because reparations wouldn't solve any of those structural problems. And I think Britain has a huge role to play. And it's very rarely talked about. You know, Trump's launched a trade war. We're all talking about trade wars. In trade, we continue to screw African countries every single day. The EU has been screwing African countries from its inception. I've never heard a Brexiteer complain about the EU on the grounds of its injustice towards Africa, interestingly, even though they use every other argument at their disposal. They're not interested in that one. So I think that it's all a connected history. And I would never stand against reparations. I would never be against it in an argument. So I'll stand with marches for reparations. But being honest, I worry. I think we have some ideological work to do to be able to use them. I would like to see, if there were reparations, them really being transformative. And I don't think that could happen today. I'm
Luke?
just looking at Ron.
Okay, look, I think we could go on all night, but I think we kind of need to end at some point. We need to get into the business of signing books, having conversations, because that's going to take another hour or so. So let's kind of get into that. So can I just kind of give a heartfelt thanks to Afua and David? Can we get a round of applause, please, guys?